You probably won't believe me if I tell you I majored in physics in college. I'm a scientist. Actually, I was an electronics engineer. Started in 1960. In 1966, the Birch Society asked me to give that up and go to work for the Birch Society. I did, which meant 50 years plus. No regrets. Okay, we hear a lot about fake news today. I want to give you an example of fake news before we get into this, all right? I have Life magazine here. Life magazine was probably the most popular magazine in our country for many years, all right? In 1968, there was a Democrat convention in Chicago, and there was a riot. And one more page and I got what I want to get here. Okay, there was a riot and the feds came out and they investigated and they said that the police rioted, okay? And they put this picture up. I don't know how many of you can see it, but I'll leave it up here and you can take a look at it later. All right, here's a couple of policemen and hammering two guys. And the police were the bad people and so on, and that was the message that was created by Life magazine. Okay, now this was December 6th, 1968. Not too long after that, in 1969, I should have stressed that that was taken in Chicago. Chicago was the place where they had the riot. And so forth. So just about a year later, Life magazine came out with this issue. And this issue had the same picture, right? But they said this one was in Princeton, New Jersey. Okay? So you get a good picture and you want to continue to use it. All right, now I'm going to suggest something here, and I'll leave these up here and you can come up and take a look. I'm going to suggest to you that the young people on the floor there being beaten by the police are mannequins, and that the whole picture was staged by the fake news. And this was 68 and 69. Now, I've seen that picture many, many times since. And they usually refer to it as Chicago, but sometimes they go back to Princeton, New Jersey. Now here's 1998, the same picture. Wow. We're back in New Jersey. we're back in Chicago. We went from Chicago to Princeton, New Jersey, now we're back in Chicago, right? But my point mostly is the fact that the picture was staged. They had a picture of a riot scene, and they blew it up life-size, and they put these two creatures on the ground, and the two policemen come along, guys bopping them and so forth. How many of these demonstrators at these riots were wearing khaki pants, white bucks is what we used to call them, and short haircuts? How many of them back then? Nobody. Nobody. But the mannequins, that's the way they were dressed, okay? So you can come up and take a look at this later after we finish. I want to tell you, too, that we have a booklet here that's the substance of my speech. We have a DVD. We have the UN one that I did, and probably a few other things. All right, so let's get into this very important subject called Dollars and Cents by myself, by McManus. Widely held views. People say economics is the dismal science, right? It puts people to sleep. It's hard to understand. They don't want to study economics, and so they let things happen to them like what's happening to our country. All right? Economics, to me, is the science of what makes people act. What makes people act? It's the study of human action. All right? So it's the study of money and the medium for exchange, and money being the medium for exchange. There are three types of, well, let's go back here. What makes people act? And the simple answer is that people act for profit. Right? Now, it can be monetary profit. It can be religious profit. It can be some other kind of profit. But people act because there's something in it for them down the road. Very important. Now, that's the basic premise of economics. And you go to college today and you can study economics, they won't start off with that premise. Right? So we get three types of money. What is money? Money is a medium for exchange. There are three kinds of money. We'll discuss each of the three. Commodity money, that's gold or silver. Fiduciary money, which is paper money based on the fact that there's gold and silver behind the paper. Or fiat money, which is money that is decreed to be money and has nothing behind it other than a promise to pay, and the promise is always broken. Right? So the characteristics of commodity money: gold, silver, a lot of other things we'll talk about. Has to be valuable to everybody. Has to be transportable. Has to be divisible. And it has to be scarce. Right? If it's not scarce, then everybody's going to have some and the money's going to be worth nothing. Right? So it has to be scarce. All right? What has been used as commodity money throughout history? You can even go to the Bible and you'll find out gold and silver were used as commodity money. Right? But there were other things that were used. Seashells were used, but they broke. You know, you started exchanging them and so forth, you'd break off the seashells, so they discarded seashells. Tobacco was money for a time in some places, but the tobacco rotted, right? Cattle were money, right? But you couldn't have small transactions with the cattle as money. You'd have to cut up the cattle, right? So people gravitated. What's the best thing to use for money down through history? And as I mentioned, even in the Bible, it tells us gold and silver, right? Vladimir Lenin was the architect of Soviet Russia and a very bad man. But he is said to have declared that the best way to destroy the capitalist system was to debauch the currency. Debauch means ruin. Lenin was certainly right, said John Maynard Keynes. There is no subtler, more surer means of overturning the existing basis of society than by destroying the money. Right? Now, we have a national debt now that tops $20 trillion. All right? How many zeros are there in a trillion? 12. Well, it's an incomprehensible amount of money. Even 1 trillion, and we are in debt now more than 20 trillion, and that doesn't count unfunded obligations that are even much higher. CNS News publicized the fact that it's official. The debt tops 20 trillion for the first time. It jumps 317 billion in a single day. And that happened to be the same day that Hurricane Irma hit the United States. But my point is this: $20 trillion is an incomprehensible. The United States today is the most heavily indebted nation in all history. And what we are doing is we are committing suicide. We are allowing our government to commit suicide for our country, right? The national debt after the presidency, it was not even 1 trillion when Jimmy Carter left office in 1981. And Ronald Reagan came in and he bumped it up 2.7 trillion. Now, Ronald Reagan is supposed to be the greatest conservative since George Washington, I guess. I don't buy that, and I've written about it, but I'm not going to get into it. All right, the elder George Bush, we call him Bush 1, he went up 1.5 trillion. Clinton, 1.5 trillion. Bush 2, 5 trillion. Obama, 19 trillion. 9 trillion, excuse me. No, 9. Anyway, a lot. During the Obama administration, the United States bond rating was lowered for the first time in history from AAA to AA. Now, what does that mean? It means that if you borrowed money, you're going to have to pay more for it in return, and that a U.S. bond would not be as valuable as it was previously, right? So the solutions, what are being proposed as the solutions? Rescue by the United Nations. Now we talked about the United Nations a couple of nights ago, and we certainly don't want that. Rising indebtedness. There's 20 trillion admitted. Each citizen's share is $61,000, right? Are you a citizen? You owe $61,000, right? You have to pay before you leave camp. Good luck, huh? How about you, Professor Soon?
I think we're almost 22 trillion now. It's up another 2.
Oh, yeah, it's gone up. It keeps going up, right?
I know.
I said this, 100 trillion in unfunded liabilities that the government has incurred. What are they? Social Security. A lot of people are getting a Social Security check. There's no money in the bank. So what do? They just print the check and send it and so forth. And we get into the subject of inflation in a bit. Each family's share of the rising indebtedness is $161,000. That's how much you owe. You're the head of the family. Debt rose during the Obama years at an average of $1.8 billion a day. Now, these numbers are almost incomprehensible. What's a billion? What's a trillion? What's this? What's that? All I can tell you is it's not a good thing to happen, right? The next generation is being asked to pay for it, right? Now, here's an article in the New York Times. Why is the Federal Reserve so scared of inflation? Actually, that's a lie. The Federal Reserve is not scared of inflation. The Federal Reserve creates the inflation, right? So we will get to what is inflation in a few minutes. Fed leaders don't fear inflation. What they do fear is growing public awareness of what inflation truly is. And inflation is an increase in the quantity of currency. Now, you listen to the news at night, and they'll give you, every once in a while, they'll give you, inflation is holding steady. And what they're talking about is the price of goods. They're talking about a basket of groceries. They're supposed to measure the cost of the basket of groceries. And if you did that, you'll see that the price of the groceries is going up year after year after year. And so they'll call that inflation. No, that's the effect of inflation. What is really going up is the amount of dollars. And if the amount of dollars continues to go up, the value of the dollars continues to go down. And that's the important thing to remember. We're going to talk more about that. Fed leaders and their government partners in crime do not want the public, they want the public to believe that inflation is rising prices, a complete falsehood. Now, let me give you an example of rising prices. I went to college quite a few years ago, and I had an old junk of a car, and I could pull into a gas station, and I could ask the guy, he'd come out and service me. I could ask him for a dollar's worth of gas. I got 5 gallons of gas. 5 gallons of gas for $1. No? 5 gallons of gas today would cost what? $13, $14, right? And the same thing could be said for a lot of things. My wife told me recently she went and she bought 2 nice oranges, $1.10 each. I can remember when they were practically giving away the oranges, right? What has happened is not the cost of the orange, not the cost of the gasoline for my old heap of a car. What's different is the value of the dollar. All right, here's the New York Times. This is in 2008. U.S. plans $800 billion in lending to ease the crisis. And the article, as you can see, is written by a man named Edmund Andrews. And the little part in red is blown up, and it says they would print as much money as needed. I never thought I'd see that on the front page of the New York Times, but there it was. Right? Now, less than a year later, Fed will inject $1 trillion more to aid the economy. And this time I highlighted it in yellow, but I printed it on the other side as a way of getting more dollars into the economy, a tactic that amounts to creating vast new sums of money out of thin air. Front page, New York Times. Same man, Edwin Andrews. Now what happens is Edwin Andrews writes an article, or they tell him they want him to write an article about what the Federal Reserve is doing. So he writes the article, it goes to an editor, and maybe a second editor, and it ends up in the New York Times. Now, the most prominent item in the New York Times and in other newspapers, the most prominent thing they want you to know is the front page article on the right side of the front page. And that's where these 2 articles appeared, right? And they both tell us that the Federal Reserve is printing money like it's going out of style. Another interesting thing happened. Edmund Andrews lost his job. Edmund Andrews was an honest man, right? I don't know where he is today, but he's not writing for the New York Times anymore. Now, they talked about bailouts. They used the word. No, they didn't use the word, but anyhow, they were bailouts. The bailouts were not only for the United States, but look, 180 billion went to the Bank of Scotland. 183 billion went to Lehman Brothers. 262 went to Credit Suisse. That's in Switzerland. Okay? Goldman Sachs got a big chunk of money. Bank of America, 1.3 trillion. Morgan Stanley, 2 trillion. Citigroup, 2.5 trillion. Right? The money didn't come to you. Right? It went to these banks. And you went to the bank and you asked to borrow money, and they said, okay, you can borrow money, but the interest rate is higher. Right? You have to pay it back. So we bailed out the European Union. In addition to bailing out U.S. banks and financial institutions, huge dollar amounts have been provided to keep the EU afloat. Here's Representative Mike Pence. Have you heard of him? Right? He's got a different job today, hasn't he? He's the vice president, right? Mike Pence in 2010 said, he was a congressman from Indiana, the bailout of Greece sets a dangerous precedent of using American tax dollars for other European bailouts. Well, good for Mike Pence, right? I know some people who say they'd rather have him as president than Trump, but we take what we got and we work with it as best we can. Now, you've all heard of the Federal Reserve. What is it? First of all, people say it's the Federal Reserve Bank. It's not a bank. You can't walk into that Federal Reserve and ask for a loan. No. It has no reserves. They say it's the Federal Reserve Bank. It has no reserves. Third, it isn't federal, right? The Washington, D.C. phone book is about that thick. I don't know if they're still publishing it. Most people are using the internet now to get a phone number. But the blue pages in the Washington, D.C. phone book were the government agencies, and it was about a third of this big, thick phone book. And you could search high and low in that to find the Federal Reserve's phone number, and you wouldn't find it because it's not a federal agency, and therefore it's not in the federal listings in the phone book. Right? The Federal Reserve is an independent operation. They say it's owned by member banks. There are 12 member banks of the Federal Reserve throughout the country. But we really don't know who owns the Federal Reserve. We really don't know who's piling up all the money that the Federal Reserve creates and so forth. There's been moves to audit the Federal Reserve, and the House of Representatives actually passed a measure to do that, to audit the Federal Reserve. The Senate did nothing. Right? The Federal Reserve refuses even to respond to Freedom of Information requests because it isn't federal. So they got the best of both worlds. Where did the Federal Reserve come from? It came from a secret meeting held in Jekyll Island, Georgia in 1910. And among the people who were at that meeting, they're all listed here, just 7 of them, okay? Senator Nelson Aldrich of Rhode Island, right? He's the ancestor of Nelson Aldrich Rockefeller, right? That's where Nelson Aldrich Rockefeller got his name. A. Piatt Andrew is a United States Treasury official at 1910. Frank Vanderlip was a New York banker. Henry Davis is a New York banker. Charles Norton, a New York banker. Benjamin Strong, a New York banker. Paul Warburg, a German banker. Right? And Paul Warburg was the genius behind the whole thing, persuading these men that we needed a Federal Reserve. That was 1910. It took a couple of years. Finally, when Wilson became president in 1913, then the Federal Reserve Act was passed. And the United States started slipping down the road. Right? Frank Vanderlip was one of the people at the Jekyll Island meeting. And in 1935, he wrote an article in the Saturday Evening Post, and it was actually a portion of a book he wrote. He said, there was an occasion near the close of 1910 when I was as secretive, indeed as furtive as any conspirator at the actual conception of what eventually became the Federal Reserve System. That's quite an admission, but he made it. Okay? Now here's the New York Times. Don't politicize the Fed, right? They do everything they can to keep people from digging in and finding out what the Federal Reserve is really all about. Right? There are aspects of the Federal Reserve that I would like to be able to tell you about that I don't know. And neither does anybody else except those people at the Federal Reserve. Right? The Federal Reserve Act in 1913, its purpose to furnish an elastic currency, right? You don't want an elastic currency. You don't want it to be able to be stretched into being worth less and so on. No. What you want is good, hard money, right? Right? Section 30 of the Federal Reserve Act, look at this. The right to amend, alter, or repeal this act is hereby expressly reserved. You can't change it according to itself. Now, hold on a minute, I say. Hold on a minute. Elastic currency guarantees inflation. What Congress creates also, Congress can void. Congress did pass the legislation allowing for there to be a Federal Reserve. If Congress did that, the Congress can void it and stop there being a Federal Reserve. And that's what I would like to see. But I would like not to see it done immediately. I would like to see Congress act and say, okay, 2 years from now, the Federal Reserve is abolished. And in the 2 years' time, we take the steps needed to keep the economy in the United States going and not to rob everybody's bank account. All right, now here's the money. I have copies of the money over here. I'm going to go over and get them. Yeah. You know the size of a dollar bill that you have in your pocket, or 5 or so forth. They used to print them big, right? All right, now, are you a good reader? Come on up here and read this for me. This is a silver certificate, okay? So read that, and then that little small point, and then down here, and then down here. Check. Okay?
It says silver certificate at the top. It says, this certifies that there has been deposited in the Treasury of the United States of America $1 silver payable to the bearer on demand.
Okay, so you could take that up to any place, and you could get a silver dollar. Now, I have a silver dollar in my pocket. All right? Here's a silver dollar. It's now worth $15. What happened? Too many pieces of paper. Right? Now, something else about it, too. I want you to listen, if you can, and listen for the tingle. This is what you get when you have a real precious metal coin, all right? Did you hear the tingle? All right? I have another coin here, a half dollar. The new sandwich coins. You can see it's half copper, half something else. It's not silver, all right? It looks the same at the front, all right? Any tingle? No, no tingle. So I like money that gives me a tingle. And I would guess you do as well. Okay, now here's what happened. You can see the first bill up there. That's a $1. And it's a 10, I guess. And it's a large one like this one. And that one is in gold, right? It says at the top of it, this certifies that there is $10 in gold payable to the bearer on demand, right? And then the next one is the one I had him read, although it's the smaller one here, it's the same. This, incidentally, was 1923. I meant to mention that, right? And then we see the fourth one down, redeemable in lawful money, right? In 1933, President Roosevelt decreed that the American people should turn in whatever gold they had. And as a patriotic American, most of them did. People came down and they traded in their gold that they had, gold coins or gold bullion or gold bars, whatever they had. They traded it in for paper. And they were promised that when the Great Depression was over, that they would be able to get their gold back. And son of a gun, they broke the promise. Son of a gun, they broke the promise. Okay. So we went to redeemable in lawful money. That's the $5 bill, the fourth one down in the pile. Now, it said on it that this is redeemable in lawful money. So a guy took a $20 bill up to a local bank, and he put it up on the counter, and he said, I'd like some lawful money, please. And the girl teller said, would you like 2 10s or 4 5s? Or no, he said, I would like some lawful money. That to me is not lawful money. And so she went and got the boss. Well, the boss came out and said, what can I do for you, sir? He said, I'd like some lawful money. And what do you consider lawful money? He said, gold or silver. He said, I can't give you that. He said, okay, you proved my point. He took his $20 bill and went out the door, right? And anybody could have done that, and that would have been your problem. That's what you would have ended up with. So now we have the money that you have in your pocket, your purse, right? You look at it, you see, is it redeemable? Does it say it's redeemable in anything? No. Not at all. Not at all. The amount of those dollars is determined by the Federal Reserve, right? And Congress should put a leash on the Federal Reserve, but they don't. Correct definition of inflation: an increase in the quantity of currency, not a steady rise in prices. Don't blame the counterfeiter, even though he's a thief. Don't blame the government. Don't blame the government's partner. No, excuse me, blame the counterfeiter. Blame the government's partner, the Federal Reserve, for flooding the nation with unbacked currency created out of nothing. Right? How do they do it? Well, they have a very fancy printing press. Now, here's the Wizard of Id. Look on the left here, he says, the people are crying up to the id. He's the head of the country. what are you going to do about inflation? He said, print more money. And the guy comes out and says, we can't do that, sire. Why not? There's no more gold to back it up. And the id says, phew, for a minute I thought we were out of paper. Don't federalize the Federal Reserve. New York Times comes out again. They're partners in these crimes that are being committed. Why do they fear an audit? They fear an audit because it would end the Fed's secrecy. The owners of the Federal Reserve would become known. Massive transfers of money would be bared. Entire financial structures would be exposed. Public demand would rise for real change and get back to commodity money, gold and silver. The Federal Reserve is an unelected few appointed to its board of governors by the president for 14-year terms, and they are awarded completely unconstitutional power to decide the amount of currency, establish the value of the currency, set the interest rates, create booms and busts, and are they good at doing that? They have even admitted that they sped up the amount of currency in circulation prior to an election to make their favorite candidate look good and have the American people vote for him. Or they have done the opposite to defeat a potential candidate. I wouldn't be surprised to find some Federal Reserve manipulations going on before the 2018 congressional elections, and certainly before the 2020 next presidential election. Now, Karl Marx, in the Communist Manifesto, printed in 1848, he came out and he said one of the things that he wanted, number 5, was centralization of credit in the hands of the state by means of a national bank with state capital and an exclusive monopoly. Well, that's what we got, except that we went one step further. The Fed is not a federal agency, it's privately owned, and we don't know who the owners are. The Federal Reserve is the brainchild of Edward Mandell House, President Wilson's top advisor. He wrote in his own 1912 book, Philip Drew, Administrator, that he was working for socialism as dreamed of by Karl Marx. And the Federal Reserve is certainly a creation that accomplished that. We want you to read The Shadows of Power, The History of the Council on Foreign Relations. The ultimate goal is one of the professors at Georgetown University in Washington, who is now deceased. He was a teacher of Bill Clinton, by the way. He said the ultimate goal of the consortium, he never used the word conspiracy because he thought it was wonderful, nothing less than to create a world system of financial control in private hands, able to dominate the political system of each country and the economy of the world as a whole. That's a magnificent goal, right? Except that it's all bad. Right? This system was to be controlled by feudalist fashions by the central banks of the world acting in concert by secret meetings and conferences. That's exactly what they do. Now, why don't some economists, people who teach the economy at colleges, why don't they help expose all of this? What I'm telling you is easily backed up. Why don't other professors do this? You go to a college, you study economics, and you come out of there and your head's spinning, right? Right? I asked a young fellow one time, who was a friend of my son, who was off at college, the University of New Hampshire, in fact. I asked him, I said, what do you study? He said, economics. I said, oh, good. Are you into macroeconomics or microeconomics? What are you now? He says, we're into microeconomics. I said, okay, well, let me ask you a question. Do you understand any of that gibberish? And he said, no. I said, do you think the professors understand any of the gibberish that they're sending you? And he said, no again, right? He was right. So he at least learned that much, not to trust these guys. In 1993, the Fed chairman, a man named Alan Greenspan, told the House Banking Commission that 189 economists worked for the Fed. 171 of them worked for regional branches of the Fed. 370 worked as statisticians or officers for the Fed. 209 of them, professors, received contracts from the Fed. Why don't professors tell the truth? There's your answer. Right there. The arrogance of power. Is that visible? Yeah. I wrote to the New York Times, and I wrote to this fellow who's an editor at the New York Times, and I said, please tell me what is inflation. Look what he wrote back. I guess if you don't know what inflation is, you don't have to worry about it. The arrogance of power. That's what that is, right? Inflation can destroy a nation. There you see what happened in Germany. At the top there you see $1 would equate to, what is it, 109 Reichsmarks. And you can see that in a period of 2 years plus, it went from 109 Reichsmarks to 4.2 trillion. And then the government came in and they said, the marks are no longer useful. We will now have a Rentenmark. And they came out with a whole new bunch of money. All right, so what happened? There's the value of the Reichsmarks. What happened is, here's a woman taking bundles of marks and heating the home by stuffing them into the furnace. Here, over on the other side, there are a couple of boys, and they're making a little fortress out of bundles of marks that weren't worth anything. Right? Here's Zimbabwe in the 1990s. $100 trillion for that one piece of paper. But you went to the supermarket and there was nothing in it. Right? I met a man who had a British accent, and I said to him, let me guess, you're from New Zealand? He said, no. I tried again. I was wrong. He finally said he was from Zimbabwe. I said, oh, poor Zimbabwe. Look what's happening to Zimbabwe. He says, I know all about it. My parents are still there. I said, well, how do they get by? He said, I have to send them dollars. And the dollars became the useful currency, but the $100 trillion of Zimbabwe currency was worth nothing. Right? Right now in Venezuela, the people are going through that. You look through your newspaper and you will see riots and so forth, and people dying and being shot, and demonstrations going on in Venezuela, which has probably the greatest oil revenue, if they can go and get it, of any nation on earth. Right? The currency in Venezuela is the bolivar. Right? Now here's a professor at Northwestern University came out with a sensible remark. Bolivars are like ice cubes now. If you're going to the fridge to take one, it's something you have to use right away because soon it's going to be gone. Right? And that's what's happening. Right? Now the U.S. Constitution says Congress shall have the power to coin money, regulate the value thereof at a foreign coin, and fix the standard of weights and measures. All right, let's analyze that. Congress shall have the power to coin money. Does it have the power to print money? No. Coin money. The people could take their precious metals, gold or silver, and go to the mint and have it stamped into coinage of a fixed size, weight, and purity. That's the Congress power that was given in the Constitution. Nothing more. Regulate the value thereof and of foreign coin. Most of the currency being used at the time of the founding of our nation was from Spain or from France, other countries. And so somebody had to come through and say, okay, $1 is worth so many pesos from Spain, or so many something else from Germany, or something else, right? That's power that was given to Congress. They could tell you what the value was, and then fix the standard of weights and measures. It's going to be 12 feet, 12 inches in a foot, and 12 feet, 3 feet in a yard, and so on. 12, how many ounces in a pound, and on you go. That was congressional power, but there was no power to print money. U.S. Constitution. Coin money? Yes. print or issue money? No. If you took your gold and your silver to the mint back in that period, they would coin it into 1 ounce coins, half-ounce coins, and so forth, and there was no charge. Right? If you wanted to get to the front of the line and you were in a hurry, you could pay a little extra, and then you could get it done quicker. All right, now the U.S. Constitution, Article 1, Section 10, talks about state. No state shall coin money, right? And the states willingly accept that. They should not emit bills of credit. Bills of credit is paper money unbacked. That's what they called paper money unbacked. Or make anything but gold or silver tender in payment of debts, right? That's still part of the U.S. Constitution. It's pretty much ignored, right? So states cannot coin money. They cannot emit bills of credit, which is paper money. They cannot make anything but gold and silver payable. Now, the attitude of the founders about this was pretty severe, right? When they got together in Philadelphia to decide to put out a whole new constitution, Oliver Ellsworth from Connecticut said, shut and barred the door against paper money. They had their fill of it. During the War for Independence, the currency in the United States that was issued was the Continental Currency, right? And it became a phrase that my parents used to use, and you don't hear it anymore, but something was not worth a continental. They knew that the paper money had just disappeared its value. James Wilson of Pennsylvania removed the possibility of paper money, disarmed the government of such power. Pierce Butler, South Carolina. Now, who's from New Hampshire? All right, keep your hand up, right? Keep your hand up. Look what your man had said. He said, bar paper money or reject the whole Constitution, right? Good for John Langdon. Okay, you New Hampshireites. You got something to be proud of then. Here's Alan Greenspan. He once said, before he got the job at the Federal Reserve, in the absence of the gold standard, there is no way to protect savings from confiscation through inflation. Now, let me just tell you that I've heard of a man who, in 1945, had $10,000, and he put it under the mattress, and he didn't put it in the bank. 50 years later, he decided to spend his $10,000. And when he put it under the mattress to begin with, he could have bought a home. $10,000 would have bought a home in 1945. When he took it out towards the end of the century, the year 2000 or so, he couldn't even put a down payment on most homes with the $10,000. What had happened? The value of the currency had been destroyed. And how was it destroyed? By flooding the world with dollars. No, you don't have to go. Here's Alan Greenspan saying that because the Congress has the power to coin money, they can transfer that, and that's why we use that power to do what we're doing. First of all, coin money didn't mean print money, and secondly, Congress can't delegate its powers. Right? The United States dollar is actually defined as 371.25 grains of silver in the U.S. Mint Act of 1792, and that's never been abolished. That still exists, all right? And we can get back to it if we dare, if we hold it, all right? So we see during the administration, things started going south. Here's something I love to say. I say this on radio shows, I say it in speeches, I'll say it anywhere. I tried to get Donald Trump to say it. America became great not because of what government did, but because of what government was prevented from doing by the Constitution. Right? Enforce the Constitution and the government would be 20% its size, 20% its cost. Okay, now let's go back to another definition here. You hear people saying the United States is a wealthy country, right? We're the wealthiest country ever. How did we become wealthy? What is wealth? Wealth is productivity. A wealthy nation is one whose people take the raw materials of the earth and fashion them into goods. People engaged in mining and manufacturing and agriculture, they are creating wealth, right? The United States now imports 90% of the clothing worn by the American people. That's dramatic. That ought to scare you a little bit. It's pretty soon going to be the same in other commodities. So there are unconstitutional agencies and programs that ought to be done away with. Foreign aid. I spoke to a bunch of fourth graders recently, and I asked if you thought that a nation heavily in debt should give away money. And the kid's sitting right there in the front row, big smile on his face. He said, no. I said, please run for Congress. Okay, unconstitutional foreign aid. James Madison, the extension of the prohibition to bills of credit, that's paper money, must give pleasure to every citizen in proportion to his love for justice. Right. So the balanced budget amendment, well, we're getting to that. All right. How do we solve this problem? Go to your Constitution. Article 1, Section 7 says, all bills for raising revenues shall originate in the House of Representatives. If we get a good House of Representatives, we got the problem taken care of. What must be done? Restate the definition of the dollar. Allow private coinage. I want there to be mints spreading up all over the country. And people come to me and say, well, if you have mints like that, there'll be some people who tell you that they're giving you a 1 ounce gold coin, but they've got some impurities in it. It's only 66% gold. I said, good. Take them to court. Sue them. And it would stop, right? Allow private coinage. That's what I would like to see. Cancel legal tender laws. This note is legal tender for all debts, public and private, and nothing else has been declared legal tender. That's terribly wrong. Restate the ban on bills of credit. That's paper money. Abolish the Federal Reserve slowly. Terminate unconstitutional programs. Cancel the income tax. All of that can be done by people who want to be free. There's Robert Welch, the founder of the Birch Society. We're getting close. All right, how do we get out of the UN? In 1997, 54 votes to withdraw. 99, 74 votes to cease funding. That's equivalent to saying I want out. 83 votes to cease funding. In 2011, there was another vote, and it was more than 83. Anybody want to guess how many? How many? 104? 177? Are we getting close? Has the program of the John Birch Society reached a lot of people who say the UN is bad news? Let's get out while we still can? Right. There's a billboard down in Arizona. I'd love to see some of them along the Mass Pike, right? But it's expensive, I know that, right? So what do? Well, we end up with the John Birch Society. Now, I mentioned I have books. You have Dollars and Cents. You have a Republic, if you can keep it. You have the book on the UN, the booklet. These are all $2 each. There's a DVD here that has overview of America and the speech I just gave you, $1. And if you really want to know who a scoundrel is, you might want to read about William Buckley, who was a real bad scoundrel. All right? Are we done? Thank you very much.